I think for anybody that's watching this, no matter what role you're in, IT, sales, support, operations, whatever, I struggle to find a reason why it's not a good idea for every single person at an organization to understand how their role specifically impacts the growth and success of the organization that they're in.
Right.
Because we see this siloing occur all the time, and it makes all of these conversations way more difficult when it comes to justifying anything from processes to tools to staffing to everything, right?
Right.
Like you have to advocate for yourself, and really the people that are doing the best, the organizations that are doing the best, they have that alignment from top to bottom, and it's clearly communicated and understood how throughout that chain, everything that everybody's doing makes sense
Right.
and it's intentional and it's purposeful, and we can attach it to a particular business metric that is for the better of the growth and success of the organization, right?
Is your role like, does it roll up to revenue? Does it roll up to, net retention, right? Like you have to know like what are the core metrics that you exist within the company for, right? Like it's like people don't just exist here to, do arts and crafts and like click on buttons on a computer. You exist to drive revenue. Every single person within any company is meant to drive revenue. It's some of them are obviously direct versus others are indirect, but you have to understand like your role to play, and especially IT and security, right? I know recently we were talking to a prospect that was going after CMMC, and they had like $20 million on the line between CMMC, ISO, SOC 2, the various frameworks that customers were starting to ask for, right? And this person did a great job. What they did is they went to the people who were in charge of like sales and account management, and they went down the list and they had like several conversations with them around, all right, like this Excel, I exported my Excel spreadsheet of like all my current customers by deal size from largest to smallest. Have any of these topics come up with any of the account managers, any of the AEs, or any of them? And slowly but surely, you're able to get, it might be a small list. It just kind of depends on, maybe it's only one or two customers asking for it. Maybe it's three or five. Maybe it's most of them. But the point is, you have to go and really figure out who's asking for it. Because maybe it's just a bunch of the people that are like $5,000 revenue for you. In which case, it's like, not worth it. They'll leave. Like whatever, right? Because if it's only going to cost you $10,000 in lost revenue and churn for not doing this type of thing, then it's not worth it. Maybe they're loud from a customer voice perspective, but if it's not going to really drive the business, then don't do it, right? Like take the loss. However, if it only happens to be maybe two customers of your 10,000, those two customers account for 80% of your revenue, well, you got to go do it, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of critical thinking involved. There's none of this is black and white. It very frequently is black or white when you talk to these things. And one of the important parts about understanding your role and sort of how you play too is understanding your core strengths and how they impact the organization as well. Because it may be a better decision for you to purposefully seek to outsource some of that work because your core strength is not security and compliance.
Right.
Your core strength as the IT director is in these other areas. Maybe you have other things that you're supposed to achieve next year. And it is just a much more efficient use of company dollars to outsource that aspect, even though this technically falls within your jurisdiction, to say, you know what, I'm making a conscious choice that for me and my salary and what else I have to contribute to the organization, it's a better use of spend to allocate that towards an outsourced vendor.
Right.
Right? Because that frees me up. And we see this a lot happen with more of the engineering types of leaders, CTOs that are much more of a engineering background, to be able to say like, do I really want my org, my developers and
Yeah.
engineers working on this? Or is it better to make our product that much better because we can actually go and drive sales and compete in the market with our
Yeah.
product, right? So that's also part of the decision-making process is know yourself, know the role that you provide to the organization, and don't be afraid to delegate or outsource that if it's a better long-term fit based off of where you are and where you're trying to go. So I think
Yeah.
that's also important to keep in mind.
It's funny that you bring up software developers, because this is really true in like the SaaS type organizations that need to become compliant. Is they think, okay, SOC 2 or ISO or what have you, that means like securing and doing work on my AWS or Azure or GCP environment. And they're like, This is all of that like this is so clearly and obviously supposed to go to a software developer because it has to do with putting up certain controls on my infrastructure, right? Which is just like not the case. Yes, definitely has to do with AWS, Azure, etc. But there's all sorts of other stuff that has nothing to do with that, right? Having like cloud backups, annual performance reviews, right? It's like, whoa, like I'm sure the software developer, like if you're a dev, like you get through all of those like certain pieces, and then you look at this like other that you're like, oh my god, why is this given to me, right? Lots of stuff that have to do with HR, with operations, depending on the framework. Some of them have to do with finance, right? So it's just like you're suddenly having to loop in a lot of people, and very oftentimes we see developers have a very challenging time because one, they're taken away from the thing that they want to be doing, and they're also having to do things that are very much non-technical, right? And so they often fail because when it comes to these compliance initiatives, you really need like a project manager who's going to coordinate between all the different people from an evidence collection perspective, and making sure everybody's on the same page. Yes, you also definitely need a technical person, but you also need like the IT guy, like, right? Most likely the software developer is not the person who's going to be joining devices to a Jamf or an Intune. They're not going to be the person who sets up, MFA or SSO for, various applications. Oftentimes that's IT, but sometimes in those really technical organizations that are SaaS companies, sometimes they don't have IT because there's so many developers that they just kind of do like a bunch of the stuff themselves.
Yeah, they're smart enough they can figure it out. It's like the
Yeah.
example you were talking about the other day. If electricity runs through it, it's my
Yeah,
responsibility.
I know. We had this one customer. It's so funny because it can really differ from organization to organization. I think like traditionally SOC 2 as a framework was really more for these kind of like enterprise SaaS companies. But now, because the SOC 2 framework has kind of like made its way through the supply chain to where like now everybody's just requiring it as this checkbox thing, it's made its way through to a lot of like professional services organizations, right? People, companies that are traditionally more like consulting or like just non-technical. And I remember there was this one client that said, yeah, we've been working on SOC 2, and he was a software developer, and he was saying, if there's electricity that runs through it, it goes through me. And I just started laughing because I was like, oh my God, like that is, that's crazy. And they expect you to do everything.
Yeah, that's that's the unfortunate reality of a lot
Yeah.
of people. This just kind of goes back to the whole idea of advocate for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
I think if this ultimately is going to impact you, then you have to be able to speak for yourself. And maybe security compliance isn't your most favorite thing in the world. Maybe that's not what you want to be doing, and that's okay. You don't
Right.
have to do it. You don't have to. There's other options that you can go through, and if it makes sense for the business to do it, then that's
Yeah.
the route that you could take. So it's really just
Yeah.
thinking about this critically, step by step. What is this? Why are we doing it? And then start to figure out, how am I going to accomplish it? What are the
Right.
options that I have at my disposal?
Right.
What's the difference between doing it internally and putting that on myself in terms of stress,
Right.
timeline, success factors
Right.
versus outsourcing components of it to somebody else? I mean, you have to
Right.
really think through this
Right.
and be able to
Who
come
I have
up
a,
with a
who I have a hard timeline for this is like my boss just saying, we need to do it in 12 months because we try to put arbitrary deadlines, or does that come with like an actual revenue amount tied to it if I like consequences, right? I think that's very different. I think if you don't have a hard timeline, then for sure you can take your sweet ass time to go learn it. I would say there are a lot of pieces to this, so it is very hard. Like, yes, there's ChatGPT today that can kind of help you, but it's still like ChatGPT ain't gonna help you with all this Intune stuff and conditional access and setting up cloud backup and kind of coming up with a incident response plan, like all that. Right, it's just a lot of work. And so I think there is a component to, if you don't know what good looks like, right? Like if you don't know what you don't know, how long is it going to take you? I think that's been the real challenge for a lot of these teams, is they sort of just like kind of meander into this, and sort of start off with the GRC platform and then realize that it's a lot more challenging than it is, especially if you're a larger organization. I would say if you're like 0 to 20 people, the SOC 2 framework is relatively easy or simple. However, when you get into more challenging frameworks or you get into larger companies doing it for the first time, it can be extremely overwhelming to the point where it's just not possible to do it without a consultant, like someone. It doesn't have to be an MSP, but like someone externally who specializes in this type of thing. The other place where I've seen a lot of mistakes from organizations is people who are SOC 2 today going after more challenging frameworks like ISO, NIST, CMMC, FedRAMP, that sort of thing, and thinking that it's just another framework like SOC 2.
Yeah, I mean, there's something we should call out there that yeah, it's a lot easier when you're 20 people versus when you're 200 people. I think that the elephant in the room there is that how did you get to 200 people without thinking about this,
Yeah.
right? So obviously, if it's in the past, but for any organization that is growing, you shouldn't wait until you're big and it's a hard problem for you to start moving in that direction, right? You may not have to have this as a dedicated initiative this year that I'm going to get SOC 2 or ISO 27001, but you should know that it's a possibility, especially if the
Right.
way that things are going now, and you should start to try to align your IT operations team and sort of internal projects to at least make progress towards that and not end up at a company where you're 200 people and the systems are so just bloated and just a mishmash of different tools and processes don't make sense and things like that because you're going to have a way harder time when you get to
Yeah.
there. So part of it is kind of knowing where you're trying to grow into. Even if you don't have to do it today, you can still start to think with the end in mind
Yeah.
and progress as your company grows in that direction. And that's what a lot of the better companies are doing today as well. You can be proactive about a lot of this stuff, and
Yeah.
doesn't
You
mean you have
don't
to
you don't
go
want to
ahead.
be the prospects that we talk to that are 200 to 300 people and don't even have an MDM solution, and basically everybody is they're in they're corporate owned devices, but there's no MDM solution, and they're not using like group policy or anything to control these devices. So they're basically all BYOD devices, and you have no idea what these people are doing with these devices, and you're probably getting hacked, right? So GRC and frameworks aside, you should probably do some of these things just because one, it's going to make your life easier as the IT managers, directors of IT, but also like you don't want to get hacked, right? Like that's probably way worse than yeah, and way more stressful than trying to go after like SOC 2 for the first time.
Yeah, it's totally cool to say, hey, we don't need this today, but as part of our 2-3 year plan,
Yeah,
we recognize that according to our forecasting and our projections, within 2-3 years, we expect to be an organization that will start to get this type of request, or that this will be necessary for, or whatever the
right,
case may be, and say, okay, cool. Now let's focus on a timeline to be able to achieve that. I don't have an
right,
MDM, or maybe this year I just focus on getting an MDM in place and starting to
right.
tie up certain things, and then next year I'll start to focus on other things. And then by the time that comes, you have a very, very quick process to actually achieving that framework because you knew that you were going to get there eventually and you
Yep.
didn't procrastinate,
Yeah.
right? That's where you really mess up is when you just continue to grow and everything's cool. We're not being asked for this. We're not being asked for
Yeah.
this, but you're not doing any sort of due diligence in the background so
Yeah.
that when the time does come, then you're like, hey, boss, like I need 400K in order to get this
Yeah.
done. And they're like, what do you mean? When in reality, it could have been incremental project work that
Yeah.
has been done as you're growing to shore this up.
Yeah, that's interesting. No, I like that perspective. If it were you, for example, what would be like your 3 or 4 things that you would start on first?
From a compliance standpoint,
Yeah, like let's imagine you got nothing, right? You really have nothing. Like, what are sort of like the key technology pieces that you'd probably start off with to make your life easier down the road?
I think one of the things that would make your life easier if you don't have it today is an MDM solution because how am I going to be able to effectively monitor and push things and understand what's happening on the company employees' devices if I don't
Hmm.
have something like that in place, right? I think a good way to understand it is that if really the crux of a lot of these frameworks is the security piece, right? That's the heavy lifting of it. So I would start to look at the zero trust framework and try to identify the pillars and the potential attack vectors that are present, and then start to look at how do I start to shore these up incrementally. Because if you're able to do that, and I think starting with, you know, The MDM is a great place to start, right? Being able to start with that and then march your way through that, then that's going to make your life way easier. And once you do get to that point, it's going to be a lot of policy creation and things like that, more of like HR processes and
Right.
more of that sort of thing. But from at least a security standpoint, you should always be thinking about security as a business in 2025 anyways, especially
Right.
if you have a remote workforce. So don't wait until compliance comes to start to work on that. I would
Yeah.
say start with the security piece first and understand, for example, email security.
Yeah.
You should be doing security awareness training. Like that's a super easy lift in
Yeah.
order to be able to assist with that and have some sort of
No before is not that expensive. It's pretty cheap.
100%, right? Like look at where could the attacks come from my people and what's going to be the biggest levers that I
Yeah.
can pull as a security leader in order to help protect the organization today, because I know if I'm doing that, then by the time that we have to go and do an audit, my workload,
Yeah.
relatively speaking, is much smaller.
Yeah. I feel like the cornerstone of those like attacks are really come down to email, identity, and device. I feel like those are kind of like the three main things. Like there's obviously a lot of like really fancy stuff out there today, SIMs and security operation centers and all that stuff. But I feel like a lot of this is really just get down to the basics, which obviously is contextually not great advice. I should say most of the people that we serve are under, let's call it 500 employees, right? So a lot of the problems come down to just really the three foundational things of identity, email, and device. And I don't know, if it was up to me, I'd probably start off with obviously we're huge Microsoft proponents because we think it really simplifies your tech stack. I'd probably just start off with like Microsoft 365 Business Premium. It's got Intune. It's got Entra ID Plan 2, I believe, right? Plan 2, so you can do all the conditional access type stuff. Or maybe it's only Plan 1, but still good enough. And then obviously the Defender for Office 365, the anti-phishing, safe links, that type of stuff. I'd probably start off with M365 Business Premium and then actually deploy the things that are in Business Premium. And then honestly, my step two, I'm kind of looking at our list of what we deploy. I would probably go with the GRC platform as my number two, because at least even if you're not, even if you don't need to become SOC 2 or ISO within a certain timeline, at least by having Business Premium plus the GRC platform, you'll know how far away you are, right? Because you'll know you're going to have your score that's you're 30%, you're at 40% or 50%, right? Or it's 80, 70%. So when the time comes, you'll at least be prepared with, all right, what's left? How far do I have to go? And there's a lot of things that you can kind of already get started on, like the policies, right? There's some policies that you might not be able, there's writing up the policies, which is the easy part. The hard part is actually doing what the policy says it does. So you might not be able to do everything, but at least you'll be able to get a lot of the work done and understand at least where you are relative to achieving the framework.
There's things like security questionnaires that you may receive as well, even if you're not specifically being asked to show your attestation, right?
Yeah.
Even being able to pull what you've done within the platform and be able to answer some of those questionnaires, being able to do things like vendor risk management, plug in your HRAS system.
Sure.
You can do a lot of the things preemptively, and you could start on a very basic package with these platforms as well. It's not like you got to go out the gate and start spending a ton of money. You can start on a very small package, just giving you the basics of what you need and sort of use that as a measuring stick towards this, especially if you do think that this is going to be something that's going to come in the future. I think relative to the overall spend of the company, throwing 25K at having this type of capacity that's an objective framework to measure yourself is a worthwhile investment.
Yeah. And the 25K, that's give or take if you're 100 employees. But if you're smaller, I've seen some of the really small orgs. And when I mean small, I feel like people start to make these types of investments somewhere between the 20 to 50 employee range is sort of when it begins. So, those people might only be spending 10, 12, 15K on that. And it's a lot, less expensive. In addition to, let's call it Microsoft 365 Business Premium, which is, I don't know, I think these days it's around $23 per user per month.
Which you should be on anyways.
Right. You're gonna be on some version of M365 or G Suite, right? But you're probably already spending that $20-ish anyway, whether you're on business standard or what have you, right?
Yeah, relative to what it gets you. I mean, that's a whole separate conversation around Microsoft, but relative to what it gets you, Business Premium is really, really solid if you're looking to go this direction. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? You
Yeah.
know, it is actually hard to make a case not to go on
Yeah.
business premium, right? Because
For
the
sure.
licensing costs are just so small compared to the impact that this can have.
Oh, especially when you consider like what the alternative would look like if you're on the Google world, right? It's like Google Workspace. Let's call it an MDM solution, like a Jamf or a Kanji or an Intune, like separately, an Okta, right? Like there's you just have to like your tech stack becomes so big so fast. And all those other adjacent tools are going to be, $10,000 a year minimum anyway. That it's like, what are you doing paying for all of these tools, right? And you quickly have tons of apps that make it more challenging to maintain. And now, like, the skill set of the IT manager that you hire also has to be higher and more expensive because there's all sorts of stuff to learn.
Managing the contracts and the renewals and
Yeah.
CS and upsells and downsells and new features, and there's just a lot to keep on top of,
Yeah.
right? Like you do talk to a lot of organizations that are big and they just sort of Frankenstein their way throughout
Yeah.
growth, and they end up reaching 200 people and they say, "Dude, my IT spend is just atrocious." Because it's so fragmented, right? They're like, God dang, I'm spending so much money on so many different tools, and then when you show them what you could essentially consolidate down to, it's like a no-brainer, right?
Oh yeah, especially for these like larger, like 200 to 300, even like 500 employee companies. When it's so funny hearing these like CISOs and directors of IT and CTOs kind of talk where it's like nobody wants to like Microsoft's just not sexy, right? It's not sexy, but it's like there's a reason why it's one of the biggest companies on the planet. It's 'cause it's really valuable, especially as you get larger and larger and larger. Obviously, all these startups are just like, what the fuck? I'm never gonna be on Microsoft, anything. But these 300-person companies where they're like, wait, I can save hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. Like, yeah, and you can like simplify. Like, it's so funny how you get into the conversation with like a defender as sort of the alternative, and they're like, the amount of times I've heard, it's not like this happens every day, but when they get into this conversation, they're so reluctant. They kind of just look at you like, man, defender is actually really good. And they're like, all right, like E5 it is, right?
Well, it's a funny thing that we've heard on more than one occasion is when somebody says, "Yeah, like I get that, but isn't it risky to move all your stuff just to
Oh
Microsoft?"
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Like, isn't it risky to do that? We have a lot of explaining to do.
yeah. It's. I've heard that sometimes from people using like really random MDM solutions, for example, and you're like, wait a second. You think this 300-person organization that is developing and managing and selling this MDM solution is going to be more secure and more well equipped than Microsoft? I'm sorry, but Microsoft ain't going anywhere, baby. Like that 300-person MDM solution, who knows what it'll be in 2 years?
But we want to diversify risk, right?
We want to diversify risk. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.